Mason Reynolds had seen death too many times during his decade in the military, but never this close, just steps from his porch in the Montana blizzard. The gray mass lying motionless on the snow could easily be mistaken for discarded clothes if not for the eyes, amber eyes with the faintest flicker of life. As Mason knelt, the bundle of bones with dirty gray fur, for there was nothing else to call it but a bundle of bones, tried to lift its head and unbelievably licked his hand. In that moment, Mason knew that no matter how cold the night, how fierce the blizzard, he would do anything to keep that flicker of life from extinguishing. What happened in the following moments would alter not just one life, but an entire community forever. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The isolated town of Pine Ridge, Montana wasn't known for much beyond its harsh winters and tight-knit community of just under 5,000 souls. Nestled between mountains and forests, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. The main street ran through the center like a lifeline, connecting the scattered homes that blinked with warm light against the unforgiving snow. Mason Reynolds's cabin sat on the outskirts, deliberately distanced from others, much like the man himself. At 34, the former military K-9 handler carried more than just the physical scars from his service. The psychological wounds ran deeper, manifesting in nightmares that left him gasping at 3 a.m., in the startled flinch at unexpected sounds, in the hypervigilance that never quite turned off. His honorable discharge papers sat in a drawer alongside medical bills he couldn't afford and prescriptions he sometimes couldn't bring himself to fill. The cabin itself told Mason's story better than he ever could. Military precise organization in some areas, chaotic abandonment in others. Photos of his unit and their dogs face downward on shelves, too painful to look at, too precious to put away. His therapy journal lay open but blank beside his bed, the counselor's suggested exercises untouched. Across the snow-covered field from Mason's property stood Nancy Williams's farmhouse, a century-old structure that had weathered storms both meteorological and personal. At 78, Nancy's body had begun to betray her sharp mind, her hands now gnarled with arthritis that made her former work as a military veterinarian impossible. Widowed 5 years ago when her Vietnam veteran husband succumbed to Agent Orange complications, she spoke to his photograph each night over dinner. Her children called on holidays from Seattle and Boston, their voices distant in more ways than geographic. In town, Elizabeth Carter ran the Pine Ridge Animal Shelter, with a combination of bureaucratic precision and barely concealed desperation. At 39, she'd abandoned a promising corporate career after rescuing her first abused dog, only to find that passion didn't pay the mounting costs of saving animals in a county with limited resources. Each month, she quietly transferred funds from her dwindling savings to cover medications the shelter budget couldn't afford. Each night, she took home the files of the animals she couldn't save, as if studying their details might somehow bring them back. What none of them knew was how their lives would intertwine, because of one German shepherd who had no name, only a history written in scars across his emaciated body. A dog who, despite everything humans had done to him, still found the courage to lick a stranger's hand in the snow. And somewhere in Pine Ridge, watching from behind respectable community standing, Victor Hayes nursed his own demons with bourbon and rage, his connection to the dog a dark thread that would eventually unravel everything. The wind howled like a wounded animal as Mason carried the barely breathing shepherd into his cabin. Blood from the dog's paws left a stark crimson trail against the pristine snow, the only evidence that this skeleton of a creature was still alive. Inside, Mason quickly gathered every blanket he owned, creating a nest before the fireplace. His hands, steady in combat but now trembling, fumbled with his phone as he called the emergency number Elizabeth had posted throughout town for animal emergencies. "I need help," he said, voice cracking. "I've got a dog, German Shepherd. He's barely alive." While waiting for help to arrive, Mason filled a shallow bowl with warm water. adding a pinch of salt, something he remembered from his military days when they'd needed to hydrate wounded dogs in the field. Kneeling beside the shepherd, he dipped his fingers into the water and moistened the dog's cracked lips. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice taking on the soft cadence he'd once used with the military K9s. "Stay with me now." The dog's eyes flickered, amber irises barely visible through swollen lids, and focused momentarily on Mason's face. Despite everything, the shepherd's tail moved once, a ghost of a wag against the blankets. The gesture triggered a flood of memories. Mason was suddenly back in Afghanistan, the desert heat suffocating as he worked alongside Ajax, his German shepherd partner. They'd cleared buildings, found explosives, saved lives together. Until that final day when an IED had taken Ajax and 2 team members, leaving Mason with a leg full of shrapnel and a heart full of ghosts. Sir, are you with me?" Mason blinked, finding Elizabeth Carter kneeling across from him, medical kit already open. He hadn't heard her enter, a dangerous lapse for someone with his training. Behind her stood Dr. Morgan, the town's only veterinarian, his weathered face grave as he assessed the situation. "I found him by the side of the road," Mason explained, moving back to give them space. "During my evening walk." Dr. Morgan nodded without looking up, his hands already carefully examining the shepherd. Temperatures dangerously low, severe dehydration, multiple infected wounds, and the worst case of deliberate starvation I've seen in 30 years of practice. Elizabeth methodically set up an IV line while Dr. Morgan continued his assessment. Several partially healed fractures, evidence of cigarette burns on the abdomen, neck abrasions consistent with a heavy chain or improper collar. Mason's fists clenched involuntarily. "Someone did this on purpose?" "No question," Dr. Morgan replied grimly. "This isn't neglect. This is methodical abuse." Elizabeth glanced up at Mason, her professional demeanor momentarily cracking. "We see cases of neglect all the time. This is different. Someone wanted this dog to suffer before he died." Outside the window, Mason noticed movement. Nancy Williams watching from her porch across the field, her silhouette illuminated by her porch light. Even from this distance, he could feel her concern cutting through the blizzard. Dr. Morgan sat back on his heels after starting the IV fluids. "I'll be honest with you both. This dog has maybe a 20% chance of making it through the night. And even if he does, recovery will be long, painful, and expensive." "What does he need?" Mason asked. "More than we can provide here," Elizabeth admitted. "Ideally, he should be at the veterinary hospital in Billings, but the pass is closed due to the storm. So we work with what we have," Mason said firmly. Dr. Morgan nodded, respect flickering in his eyes. "I can leave you with fluids, antibiotics, and some emergency supplies. Elizabeth knows how to administer them, but someone needs to monitor him constantly. His body temperature is dangerously low, and he could go into shock at any moment." "I'll do it," Mason said without hesitation. "I've had medical training and experience with military dogs." Elizabeth exchanged a glance with Dr. Morgan. "Mason, I know you mean well, but with your condition—" "My PTSD doesn't make me incapable," Mason cut in sharply. "I know dogs. I know German shepherds especially." An uncomfortable silence filled the room, broken only by the shepherd's labored breathing. "He'll need to be fed carefully," Dr. Morgan finally said, accepting Mason's resolve. "Refeeding syndrome is a serious risk with starvation cases. Too much food too quickly could kill him." "Small amounts, easily digestible," Mason nodded. "I remember the protocol." As Dr. Morgan packed up his supplies and provided detailed instructions, a soft knock came at the door. Elizabeth opened it to find Nancy Williams standing there, leaning heavily on her cane, a pot of something steaming in her free hand. "I saw the commotion," she said, her voice strong despite her frail appearance. "Brought some bone broth. It's easy on the stomach but has nutrients. Used to use it for the military dogs when they came back injured." Mason looked at her in surprise. You worked with military dogs? Veterinarian with the K9 units in Vietnam, she replied matter-of-factly. Seen cases like this before. Not often, but I've seen them. Her eyes drifted to the shepherd, and something hardened in her expression. The monsters who do this never change, just the decade they operate in. Dr. Morgan accepted the broth gratefully. Nancy's right. This might be exactly what he needs to start with. As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth hesitated at the door. The shelter can't officially take financial responsibility for a case this severe. Our budget, she trailed off, the unspoken reality of rural animal rescue hanging in the air. I'll cover it, Mason said, ignoring the mental calculation of his already strained finances. Mason, I said I'll cover it, he repeated firmly. After they left, Mason settled beside the shepherd, maintaining the careful vigilance he'd perfected in combat. The dog's breathing remained shallow, his body occasionally trembling despite the blankets and the fire's warmth. You've got fight in you, Mason whispered, gently stroking the least injured area he could find, just behind the shepherd's ear. I can see that. Held on this long when most would have given up. The shepherd's eyes opened briefly, meeting Mason's gaze with unexpected clarity. You're safe now, Mason continued, his voice breaking slightly. I don't know what happened to you or who did this, but you're safe here. As the night deepened and the blizzard raged outside, Mason maintained his watch. He administered the medications as directed, spooned tiny amounts of Nancy's broth into the shepherd's mouth, and monitored every slight change in breathing or temperature. Around 3 a.m., the shepherd's condition worsened. His breathing became more labored, and his already weak body began to shake violently. No, Mason murmured, reaching for his phone to call Dr. Morgan. Stay with me, buddy. Stay with me. As he dialed, the shepherd let out a soft whimper, the first vocal sound he'd made, and pressed his head weakly against Mason's hand. Something broke open in Mason's chest, a feeling he'd walled off since losing Ajax and his teammates, a feeling of connection, of purpose, of being needed. I'm not giving up on you, he promised, waiting for Dr. Morgan to answer. And I don't think you're giving up either. Outside, the storm began to subside, the wild howling of the wind gradually yielding to the soft silence of falling snow. Dawn was still hours away, but in the cabin's warm glow, 2 wounded souls continued their fight, one for life itself, the other for a reason to fully live again. 1 week had passed since that blizzard night, and against every medical prediction, the shepherd was still alive. Mason sat on the cold metal chair in the Pine Ridge Animal Shelter's recovery room, watching the dog's chest rise and fall in the shallow rhythm that had become distressingly familiar. Though still critical, the shepherd had shown microscopic improvements. His temperature had stabilized, the most severe infections had responded to antibiotics, and occasionally he would open his eyes and track Mason's movements around the room. You're quite the miracle worker, Elizabeth said, entering with fresh IV bags. Dr. Morgan's calling him the miracle dog around town. Mason shook his head. He's doing the work. I'm just sitting here. For 8 hours a day, every day this week, Elizabeth pointed out. Most people would have dropped off astray and been done with it. Mason didn't respond. He couldn't explain the inexplicable connection he felt to this broken animal. How sitting in this room felt like the only productive thing he'd done since leaving the military. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn object. Found this embedded in what was left of his collar, he said, handing Elizabeth a partially damaged metal tag. It was under layers of duct tape and dirt. Elizabeth examined the tag, her brow furrowing. This looks military. Part of the numbering system is similar to dog tags. She looked up. You think he might have been a working dog? His behavior suggests training, even in his condition, the way he tracks movement, how he positions himself despite his weakness. Mason hesitated. And there's something in his eyes. A intelligence, awareness. Working dogs have it. Elizabeth turned the tag over, squinting at the corroded metal. There's more numbers here, but I can't make them out. I have a friend at the VA who might be able to help identify it. I'd appreciate that, Mason said, returning his attention to the shepherd who had awakened and was watching them with those haunting amber eyes. A commotion in the hallway interrupted their conversation. Mason recognized the raised voice of Philip Donnelly, the shelter's board chairman and owner of the town's largest real estate company. Completely irresponsible allocation of resources, Donnelly was saying as he pushed open the door. This facility exists to serve the community, not pour thousands into a single animal that will likely die anyway. Elizabeth stiffened. Mr. Donnelly, we have a strict quiet policy in the recovery area. Donnelly ignored her, his cold gaze sweeping over the shepherd before landing on Mason. Mr. Reynolds, I understand you volunteered to cover this animal's expenses, but surely you realize the futility here. The humane choice would be euthanasia. Mason felt a familiar pressure building in his chest, the precursor to the rage that had cost him more than one relationship since returning from overseas. He focused on his breathing, using the techniques his therapist had taught him. The humane choice, he said carefully, is to give him a fighting chance. Dr. Morgan believes he can recover. Dr. Morgan is a sentimentalist who can't afford to upgrade his 20-year-old equipment, Donnelly replied dismissively. Elizabeth, the board meeting is in 30 minutes. I expect a full accounting of all expenses related to this case. After Donnelly left, Elizabeth released a shaky breath. I'm sorry about that. He's difficult. He's an ass, Mason corrected flatly. Why does he care so much about one dog? He cares about the bottom line and appearances. Elizabeth began checking the shepherd's vital signs. Pine Ridge likes to present itself as the perfect small town. Strays, abuse cases, they don't fit the image. Mason watched her efficient movements. You're good at this. Professional. Elizabeth smiled slightly. I was a veterinary technician before moving into shelter management. Still keep my certification current. Her smile faded. Though lately, I've been wondering if I made a mistake. We're always underfunded, understaffed. Some days it feels like bailing out the ocean with a teacup. A knock at the door interrupted them. Nancy Williams stood in the doorway, an insulated bag in her hand. Brought some of that bone broth. Added some egg yolk today. Protein he can digest without overloading his system. How do you know so much about this? Elizabeth asked, accepting the bag gratefully. 40 years in veterinary medicine, most of it with military working dogs, Nancy replied, moving closer to examine the shepherd. Her gnarled hand gently touched his head. Vietnam first, then training facilities stateside. Nancy was just telling me about her work, Mason said, something protective in his voice. The old woman had become a daily visitor, bringing not just broth, but decades of experience that often surpassed even Dr. Morgan's knowledge of trauma cases. The shepherd, who typically shied away from anyone but Mason, leaned weakly into Nancy's touch. He knows a friend when he sees one, Nancy murmured. She looked at the tag in Elizabeth's hand. What's that you've got there? Elizabeth explained about the tag, and Nancy's eyes sharpened with interest. May I? She took the corroded metal, holding it close to her face. These first numbers. This could be from Fort Benning. They had a specialized K9 training program. That's where I did some of my handler training, Mason said, surprised. But this doesn't look like any military dog tag I've seen. Not all programs used standard identification, Nancy said cryptically. She handed the tag back to Elizabeth. Your VA contact might be able to tell you more. As Nancy left, Mason noticed the shepherd tracking her movement until she disappeared from view. He trusts her. Animals know, Elizabeth said simply. They can sense good people. The peaceful moment was shattered when Mason's phone rang. He recognized his psychiatrist's number and declined the call. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. I haven't been going to my appointments, Mason admitted reluctantly. Been here instead. Mason, I know what you're going to say, he interrupted, that I need to take care of myself, that I can't help him if I'm not stable. Actually, Elizabeth said quietly, I was going to say that maybe you're exactly where you need to be right now. Later that afternoon, Mason stepped outside for fresh air, surprised to find the temperature had risen enough to melt some of the snow. Spring was still distant, but the brutal edge of winter had momentarily softened. He was about to return inside when a helicopter passed overhead, the distinctive thump-thump of its rotors cutting through the quiet. Mason felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He gripped the railing, forcing himself to breathe as flashbacks threatened to overtake him. The ambush, the explosion, Ajax's body thrown like a rag doll, his teammates' screams. He barely registered the shelter door opening behind him. Mason, are you... Oh. Elizabeth stopped, recognizing what was happening. It's the helicopter, isn't it? Mason nodded stiffly, unable to speak as he fought to remain in the present. Come inside, Elizabeth said gently, quickly. She led him back to the recovery room where the shepherd lay. As soon as Mason entered, visibly distressed, something remarkable happened. The dog, who had barely moved independently for a week, lifted his head and whined softly. He's responding to you, Elizabeth whispered. Mason sank into the chair beside the shepherd, his breathing still ragged. To his astonishment, the dog dragged himself across the small distance separating them, collapsing with his head against Mason's boot. The simple contact anchored him, pulling him back from the edge of his flashback. He knows, Elizabeth said, wonder in her voice. He recognizes a panic attack. Mason placed a trembling hand on the dog's head. Thank you, buddy. After Elizabeth left, Mason sat in silence, his hand resting gently on the shepherd. Looks like we might be helping each other, he murmured. That evening, as Mason prepared to leave, Elizabeth met him at the front desk with a troubled expression. I got a call from my contact at the VA, she said. The numbers on that tag. They match a special training unit that was disbanded 4 years ago after some controversy. What kind of controversy? She wouldn't say over the phone, but Elizabeth hesitated. She asked if the dog had any distinctive markings or training behaviors. Mason thought about the shepherd's reactions, his alertness despite weakness, his response to the helicopter, his intervention during Mason's panic attack. He's got a small white mark on his chest, shaped almost like a diamond. Elizabeth's face paled slightly. My contact said to look for exactly that. She's sending someone to meet with us tomorrow. Did she say anything else? Just one thing, Elizabeth replied, her voice dropping. If it's who we think it is, he shouldn't be alive. As Mason drove home through the gathering darkness, his mind raced with possibilities. Who was this dog? Why was his existence apparently impossible? And most disturbingly, what connection might he have to Mason's own past? The lights were on at Nancy's house as he passed, and on impulse, he pulled into her driveway. She answered his knock almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting. The tag, Mason said without preamble. You recognized it, didn't you? Nancy's weathered face revealed nothing as she stepped back, inviting him in. Come inside, son. There's coffee on, and some things I probably should have told you sooner. Nancy's kitchen felt like a time capsule from a different era. Worn linoleum floors, cabinets painted robin's egg blue decades ago, and a collection of copper-bottom pots hanging above a stove that had surely witnessed the preparation of thousands of meals. The room smelled of coffee and something sweet, cinnamon, maybe, and was warm in a way that went beyond temperature. Sit, Nancy instructed, pouring coffee into a mug that proclaimed "World's Best Grandpa," with the faded portrait of a man who shared her sharp eyes. Williams, she explained, noticing Mason's glance. Never could bring myself to put it away after he passed. Mason accepted the mug, the familiar weight of ceramic against his palms somehow grounding. The tag, he prompted gently. Nancy settled across from him with a soft grunt, her arthritic hands curling around her own mug. I recognize the numerical sequence, she admitted. It's from a specialized training program that operated at Fort Benning about 4 to 6 years ago. Not standard military. Something adjacent." "What kind of adjacent?" Mason asked, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. "The kind with minimal oversight and maximal deniability," Nancy replied, her voice hardening. "William got wind of it toward the end of his life. He'd maintained connections with military K-9 programs after Vietnam. Consultant work, mostly. Started hearing rumors about a program developing enhanced response dogs." "Enhanced how?" "Training methods that pushed boundaries," Nancy said carefully. "Conditioning techniques that traditional programs would consider excessive." Mason thought of the shepherd's emaciated body, the scars, the burns. Torture. "They wouldn't call it that," Nancy said, her disgust evident. "They'd call it stress inoculation or adaptive response training." William reported what he heard to his old commander, but nothing came of it. And then he got sick and... She trailed off, looking at the mug in her hands. "I'm sorry," Mason said softly. Nancy nodded once, acknowledging his sympathy without dwelling on it. About 2 years after William passed, I saw a brief news item about a training facility at Fort Benning being shut down after a training incident resulting in handler injuries. Nothing specific, but the timing aligned with what William had heard. Mason leaned forward. "And you think our shepherd was part of this program?" The tag sequence, the white diamond marking, his responses despite his condition, it fits, Nancy confirmed. "But there's something else you should know, Mason. If I'm right about this dog's background, his training might have been designed to create a certain type of response to particular triggers, combat-specific behaviors, possibly beyond what even standard military K-9s are trained for." "Are you saying he might be dangerous?" Nancy's eyes met his, level and direct. "All dogs with specialized training can be dangerous in the wrong circumstances, but that's not what concerns me. What concerns me is who might be looking for him." The implication hung in the air between them. If the shepherd was part of a controversial program, his very existence might be evidence that someone would prefer to eliminate. "The person Elizabeth's contact is sending tomorrow," Mason began, "could be legitimate or could be connected to whoever had this dog before," Nancy finished. "We should be cautious." Mason nodded, his tactical training already mapping out scenarios and responses. "I'll call Elizabeth, warn her. Maybe we should move him." Nancy's phone rang, interrupting him. She answered, her expression quickly shifting to concern. "Yes, he's here. We'll come right away." She hung up and turned to Mason. "That was Elizabeth. Someone broke into the shelter about 20 minutes ago. Nothing appears to be missing or damaged except the recovery room," Mason finished, already on his feet. "The shepherd is safe," Nancy assured him, grabbing her coat. "Elizabeth moved him to the isolation ward yesterday as a precaution, but his medical records are gone and someone accessed the computer files. They're looking for him," Mason said grimly. Within 15 minutes, they arrived at the shelter where 2 police cruisers sat with lights flashing. Officer Trent Miller, a former high school classmate of Mason's, met them at the entrance. "Weird one," Trent said without preamble. "Security camera caught a single male subject, face covered, knew exactly where to go and what to look for. Disabled the alarm like he had the code." "Inside job?" Mason asked. "Or someone with access to inside information," Trent agreed. Nothing else disturbed, not the donation box with cash, not the medications, just the records for your shepherd. Elizabeth appeared behind Trent, her face drawn with worry. "I've moved him to my office for now. He's agitated. Seems to sense something's wrong." Mason followed Elizabeth through the shelter to her small office, where the shepherd lay on a makeshift bed, visibly tense despite his weakness. When Mason entered, the dog lifted his head, a soft whine escaping him. "Hey, buddy," Mason said softly, kneeling beside him. "You're safe." The shepherd relaxed marginally, though his eyes remained alert, tracking every movement in the doorway. "What's our next move?" Elizabeth asked, glancing between Mason and Nancy. "The contact from the VA is supposed to arrive tomorrow morning." "I'm not sure we should wait," Mason replied. Whoever broke in knows he's here. They might come back better prepared. He can't be moved far in his condition, Nancy warned. And we need to consider who we can trust. I trust you too, Mason said firmly, and I think I trust Dr. Morgan. Beyond that, he shook his head. Elizabeth looked troubled. Philip Donnelly has the alarm codes. So do all board members and the night volunteers. That's quite a list, Nancy observed. Too long to narrow down quickly, Mason agreed. Which means we need a different approach. I think we should take him somewhere unexpected while we figure this out. Where? Elizabeth asked. My cabin, Mason decided. It's isolated, defensible, and the last place anyone would look for a dog needing medical care. Nancy nodded slowly. I can bring my old equipment. Between my experience and Elizabeth's training, we can manage his basic care. It's risky moving him at all, Elizabeth cautioned. Riskier to leave him here, Mason countered. Someone knows he exists and wants either him or information about him badly enough to commit breaking and entering. The decision made, they worked quickly. Dr. Morgan, called in despite the late hour, reluctantly agreed with their assessment and provided additional supplies and medication. Elizabeth took a leave of absence, citing a family emergency, and Nancy packed her vintage veterinary equipment. By midnight, Mason's cabin had been transformed into a makeshift veterinary hospital. The shepherd, exhausted by the move, slept fitfully on a bed near the fireplace, his IVs hanging from a repurposed coat rack. He handled the move better than I expected, Elizabeth said, checking his vital signs. Almost like he's used to being transported while injured. Given what Nancy's told us about his possible background, that wouldn't surprise me, Mason replied, securing the cabin's windows. His military training had kicked in fully now, his movements precise and focused as he created a secure environment. Nancy sat heavily in Mason's armchair, the stress of the evening evident in the deeper lines on her face. We should establish a watch rotation. I'll take first. You'll rest, Mason interrupted gently. I've got first watch. Elizabeth second. You third, and only if you're up to it. Nancy looked ready to protest, then sighed. Fine. But wake me if anything changes with our patient. And Mason, remember what I said about potential triggers. We still don't know what kind of training this dog received. As Nancy and Elizabeth settled in for rest, Mason sat beside the shepherd, his hand resting lightly on the dog's bony shoulder. What happened to you? He murmured. And why does someone want to find you so badly? The shepherd's eyes opened briefly, meeting Mason's with that uncanny intelligence that continued to surprise him. We'll figure it out, Mason promised. You're not going back to whoever hurt you, not while I'm breathing. Outside, the wind picked up, driving fresh snow against the windows. Mason checked his phone. No signal, unsurprising during a storm in these mountains. They were effectively cut off until morning, which could be either a blessing or a curse depending on who was searching for them. As the night deepened, Mason maintained his vigil, memories of other watchers in distant deserts and mountains overlaying the present. The shepherd slept more peacefully now, occasionally twitching in dreams that Mason hoped weren't nightmares. Around 3 a.m., a sound outside snapped Mason to full alertness, the crunch of tires on snow, then silence. He moved silently to the window, careful not to silhouette himself against the firelight. A vehicle had stopped on the road below, its lights off. In the moonlight reflected off the snow, Mason could make out a dark SUV partially hidden by trees. Moving quickly, he woke Elizabeth. "Someone's here," he whispered. "Get Nancy and the shepherd into the back room." Elizabeth nodded, instantly alert. "What about you?" "I'll handle this," Mason replied, retrieving his hunting rifle from its locked cabinet. As Elizabeth helped Nancy move the shepherd, Mason positioned himself with a clear view of the approach to the cabin. Minutes stretched into an agonizing half-hour with no further movement from the vehicle. Then, just as Mason began to wonder if he'd overreacted, a figure emerged from the SUV and began making their way up the path toward the cabin. The person moved with military precision, using trees for cover, clearly trained. They carried something in their hand, not obviously a weapon, but Mason wasn't taking chances. When the figure was halfway to the cabin, Mason flicked on the outdoor lights, momentarily blinding the intruder. "That's far enough," he called out, his rifle visible but not aimed directly. "Identify yourself." The figure raised their hands slowly. "Captain Lisa Reeves, Veteran Affairs Investigation Unit," a woman's voice called back. "I believe Elizabeth Carter is expecting me." "You're about 12 hours early," Mason replied, not lowering his guard. "And most VA officials don't approach isolated cabins in the middle of the night during snowstorms." "The situation changed when the shelter was breached," she responded. "Your friend's call to her VA contact was intercepted. I came as quickly as I could to warn you." Mason hesitated, years of training screaming at him not to trust this convenient arrival. "Toss your credentials onto the porch, slowly." The woman complied, removing a wallet from her jacket and tossing it onto the snow-covered porch. "May I approach now? It's freezing out here." "Stay where you are until we verify," Mason instructed, retrieving the credentials without taking his eyes off her. Elizabeth appeared beside him, examining the ID. "This looks authentic, but—" "Call Officer Miller," Mason suggested. "Have him run her name." 20 tense minutes later, with Captain Reeves still waiting in the cold, Trent confirmed her identity. Only then did Mason allow her to approach and enter the cabin. Lisa Reeves was in her mid-40s, with short-cropped dark hair streaked with gray, and the unmistakable bearing of career military. She surveyed the cabin's interior with a quick, professional glance before focusing on Mason. "Where's the shepherd?" she asked without preamble. "Safe," Mason replied. "Why don't you tell us who he is, and why someone broke into the shelter looking for information about him?" Reeves' expression remained neutral. "I need to see him first. Confirm we're talking about the same animal." Nancy emerged from the back room, her posture stiff with suspicion. "He's recovering from severe abuse and starvation." "Seeing strangers agitates him." "I understand your concern," Reeves acknowledged, "but verification is necessary before I can share classified information." Mason exchanged glances with Elizabeth and Nancy before nodding reluctantly. 5 minutes, supervised. They led Reeves to the back room where the shepherd lay, now awake and alert despite his weakness. When Reeves entered, the dog's reaction was immediate and surprising. His ears perked forward, and his tail gave a weak thump against the bedding. "He knows you," Mason observed, tension coiling in his muscles. "Not me specifically," Reeves clarified, keeping her distance. "But likely my scent profile, military-issue detergent, standard VA building smell, things he would associate with his early training." She studied the shepherd intently, noting the white diamond marking on his chest and the pattern of scars across his body. Finally, she nodded. "This is definitely him." Subject designation Echo 7, one of the last dogs from Project Cerberus before the shutdown. Project Cerberus, Elizabeth repeated. "What kind of name is that for a military dog program?" "The kind that should never have existed," Reeves said grimly, turning to face them. "And the kind that certain people would kill to keep buried." They gathered around Mason's scarred oak dining table, steaming mugs of coffee before them. The shepherd, now known as Echo 7, resting within sight. Captain Reeves spread several documents across the table's surface, her movements precise and controlled. Project Cerberus began 6 years ago as a specialized extension of the military working dog program, she explained, her voice clinically detached. Its stated objective was to develop advanced training protocols for dogs in high-stress combat situations. The reality was much darker. She slid a redacted document toward them. The project operated under a private contractor, Sentinel Security Solutions, with minimal oversight. They recruited experienced handlers from various military branches, many of whom were told they were developing life-saving techniques for K9s in the field. "And they weren't?" Elizabeth asked, scanning the document. "Some aspects were legitimate," Reeves conceded. "But the core of the program involved training methods that violated every ethical standard in animal handling. Sleep deprivation, stress position conditioning, deliberate infliction of pain to test loyalty thresholds. Mason's jaw tightened. Torture. Just call it what it is. Reeves nodded once. Echo 7 was part of the final cohort. 7 dogs selected for their exceptional intelligence and temperament. The white diamond marking was actually applied, not natural, their visual identifier. Nancy leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly together. What were they training these dogs to do that required such methods? To maintain function under extreme duress, Reeves replied. To continue mission parameters despite injury, fear, or conflicting stimuli, essentially to override self-preservation instincts. That's monstrous, Elizabeth whispered. The program was shut down 4 years ago after an incident where 3 handlers were severely injured during a training exercise, Reeves continued. The official story was equipment malfunction. The truth was that 2 of the dogs turned on their handlers, a catastrophic failure of the conditioning methods. And the dogs? Mason asked, already suspecting the answer. Officially euthanized, all 7 of them. Reeves looked pointedly at Echo. Which is why this survivor raises significant questions. Mason's protective instinct flared. He's not going anywhere. Whatever he was part of, it wasn't his choice. I'm not here to take him, Reeves assured him. I'm here because his existence proves what we've long suspected, that elements of Project Cerberus continued unofficially after the shutdown. She produced another document, this one containing a grainy photograph of a man in his 50s, well-dressed and distinguished-looking. This is Charles Westfield, CEO of the Westfield Foundation. Publicly, a philanthropist focused on veteran support programs. Privately, the primary investor behind Sentinel Security Solutions and Project Cerberus. Elizabeth gasped softly. The Westfield Foundation sponsors our shelter's adoption events. Mr. Westfield personally presents the donation checks. His foundation operates in over 30 states, primarily in rural communities with high veteran populations, Reeves confirmed. We believe it's how he recruits and maintains a network of former military personnel for various enterprises, some legitimate, others not. Mason studied the photograph, something nagging at his memory. The charity gala, last summer in Great Falls. He was there, talking about his foundation's work with PTSD service dogs. The irony is nauseating, Nancy commented dryly. After Project Cerberus officially ended, most of the dogs were indeed euthanized, Reeves continued. But we now have evidence that Westfield secretly continued the program with at least 3 of the original dogs, including Echo 7 and potentially new recruits. We believe he's been using the training methods to prepare dogs for something else entirely. What? Mason asked. Illegal dogfighting, Reeves stated flatly. High stakes, exclusive events for wealthy clients. Dogs trained with military precision to fight with maximum aggression and ignore injuries would be extremely valuable in those circles. The room fell silent, except for Echo's soft breathing. Mason looked over at the emaciated shepherd, trying to reconcile the gentle creature who had licked his hand in the snow with the weapon Westfield had tried to create. The level of starvation suggests Echo was being punished for failure, Reeves added quietly, possibly refusing to fight despite the conditioning. Mason felt a surge of something like pride. He resisted the training, which makes him extremely dangerous to Westfield, Reeves emphasized. A living example of his involvement in both the unauthorized continuation of a terminated military project and illegal dogfighting operations. The breach at the shelter confirms they know he survived, and they're looking for him. How did he end up on the side of the road near my property? Mason asked. We're still piecing that together, Reeves admitted, but we know Westfield hosted an event at his hunting lodge about 30 miles from here 3 weeks ago. Given Echo's condition, he likely escaped or was abandoned after refusing to perform and somehow made his way toward populated areas before collapsing. 3 weeks in that condition, Elizabeth murmured. It's a miracle he survived. Echo whined softly from his bed, and Mason moved to check on him. The shepherd's eyes tracked him with that uncanny awareness, and when Mason knelt beside him, Echo pressed his head weakly against Mason's hand. "What's the VA's interest in all this?" Nancy asked Reeves bluntly. "Beyond the military connection?" "Westfield's foundation has received millions in government grants for veteran programs," Reeves explained. "Programs that often don't deliver the services promised. We've been building a case against him for fraud, but the dogfighting and Cerberus connections would elevate this significantly." "So Echo is your evidence?" Mason stated flatly, still beside the shepherd. "One piece of it," Reeves confirmed. "But we need more. Specifically, we need to locate the facility where he's continuing the operation." "And how exactly do you propose to find that?" Elizabeth asked. Reeves hesitated, then said carefully, "Echo might be able to lead us there." Mason stood abruptly. "Absolutely not. Look at him. He can barely walk, let alone—" "Not now," Reeves clarified quickly. "Once he's recovered. Dogs have exceptional location memory, especially for places associated with trauma. With the right handling, he might be able to—" "No," Mason interrupted firmly. "He's not your bloodhound, and he's not going anywhere near the people who did this to him." "Mr. Reynolds," Reeves began, her tone hardening, "this is bigger than one dog. Westfield's operation is hurting veterans through fraudulent programs, abusing animals on a significant scale, and corrupting former military personnel by pulling them into criminal enterprises. Echo may be the key to shutting it all down." The tension in the room was palpable. Elizabeth looked torn, while Nancy watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. "There might be another way," Nancy said finally. "A compromise." All eyes turned to her. "The break-in at the shelter means they know Echo is in Pine Ridge, but they don't know where specifically," she reasoned. "That gives us an advantage. Instead of taking Echo back to the trauma, we could set up an opportunity for them to come to us, on our terms." "You mean use Echo as bait?" Elizabeth asked, horrified. "I mean create a controlled situation where we can identify and capture whoever Westfield sends," Nancy clarified. "If Captain Reeves is correct about the importance of Echo to their operation, they'll keep looking until they find him." Mason considered this, his tactical training engaging. "A trap. With us controlling all the variables." Reeves looked skeptical. "We'd need significant resources, surveillance, personnel, coordination with local law enforcement." "Which I'm guessing you have access to," Mason pointed out. "Potentially," Reeves acknowledged, "but it would take time to arrange." "Time works in our favor," Nancy said, gesturing to Echo. "He needs to heal anyway, and every day he gets stronger is another day we have to prepare." Before they could discuss further, the cabin's lights flickered and went out. The sudden darkness was absolute except for the glow from the fireplace. "Power outage," Mason said calmly. "Happens during storms. Generator should kick in." The expected hum of the backup generator never came. "Something's wrong," Mason said, immediately alert. "The generator is maintained weekly." He moved silently to the window, staying clear of any potential sightline. In the distance, through the swirling snow, a flash of light appeared briefly. A flashlight beam quickly extinguished. "We have company," he announced quietly. "At least one person approaching from the north side, using the tree line for cover." Reeves was instantly on her feet, her hand moving to her hip, where Mason now noticed the outline of a concealed sidearm. "Could be the same people who hit the shelter." "How far out?" "About 200 yards, moving carefully," Mason assessed. "Likely more than one, using coordinated approach." "Options?" Elizabeth asked, her voice admirably steady despite the fear evident on her face. Mason's mind raced through scenarios. "My truck is out front. If we can reach it, we might be able to evacuate." "And go where?" Nancy challenged. "In a blizzard, with roads likely watched?" "Nancy's right," Reeves agreed. "Better to defend this position than risk exposure in the open." Mason nodded, already moving toward his gun cabinet. "I've got 2 hunting rifles and a shotgun. Ammunition for all 3. "I'm qualified on rifles," Reeves confirmed. Elizabeth looked between them, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating situation. "Shouldn't we call the police?" "No cell service during the storm," Mason reminded her. "And the landline?" He picked up the receiver of his rarely used house phone. Dead silence. "They've cut the line," Reeves confirmed grimly. "This is a professional operation." Mason handed Reeves one of the rifles. "Nancy, Elizabeth, take Echo to the cellar. There's an exit that leads to the storm shelter. If things go badly, get him out that way and head for Dr. Morgan's place. It's the closest." Nancy nodded, already helping Elizabeth prepare Echo for movement. The shepherd seemed to sense the tension, his body alert despite his weakness. "What's the plan?" Reeves asked, checking the rifle with practiced ease. "Create uncertainty," Mason replied, his military training fully engaged now. "Make them question their intelligence and advantage. We need to control the engagement, not react to it." As Nancy and Elizabeth carefully moved Echo toward the cellar stairs, Mason killed the fire, plunging the cabin into complete darkness. Their eyes would adjust. Anyone coming from outside would be momentarily blind upon entry. "Multiple approaches," Mason whispered to Reeves. "Front door, back door, 2 ground-floor windows large enough for entry. I'll take the living room position, covering front and east side. You take kitchen, covering rear and west." Reeves nodded, moving silently to her assigned position. In the darkness, Mason could hear Echo whining softly as he was moved downstairs, the dog's training clearly triggering alert responses despite his condition. Then came a sound that made Mason freeze, the distinctive metallic click of a weapon being readied, somewhere outside the cabin. "They're armed," he whispered unnecessarily to Reeves. The minutes stretched in tense silence. Mason controlled his breathing, focusing on the areas of approach, waiting. This wasn't his first time in darkness, waiting for an enemy to make their move. The familiar calm of combat readiness settled over him, not the rage that sometimes consumed him in civilian life, but the cold, clear focus he'd relied on overseas. And a faint creak on the porch, someone testing a board's strength. Mason adjusted his position slightly, rifle ready, but not yet aimed. Another sound, this time at the back door, a soft scraping, like someone working on the lock. They were attempting simultaneous entry points. The storm outside masked some sounds but created others. Branches scraping against windows, wind whistling through small gaps in the cabin's construction. Mason filtered these out, focusing only on sounds that didn't belong. Without warning, the front door burst open, a dark figure rushing in. Simultaneously, the back door crashed inward. "Pine Ridge Sheriff's Department," a voice bellowed. "Everyone down on the ground, now!" Confusion flooded Mason's mind. Sheriff's deputies. How would they even know? "Federal agents!" Reeves shouted from her position, not lowering her weapon. "Hold your fire! VA investigation unit!" Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, momentarily blinding Mason. He kept his rifle pointed downward, but ready. "Mason Reynolds," a familiar voice called. "This is Deputy Clark. Lower your weapon slowly and identify yourself." "Clark, it's me," Mason called back, carefully placing his rifle on the floor. "What the hell is going on?" As lights were restored, the deputies had apparently brought battery-powered lanterns. Mason saw 4 uniformed deputies in tactical gear sweeping the cabin, while an embarrassed-looking Officer Miller stood awkwardly by the door. "Sorry, Mason," Miller said. "Anonymous tip came in about armed suspects at your cabin. Dispatcher couldn't reach you by phone to verify." Reeves stepped forward, showing her credentials. "Who called in this tip, exactly?" "Came through the emergency line," Clark explained, still looking warily between Mason and Reeves. "Caller said they'd seen armed individuals forcing their way into Mason's cabin. Given the recent break-in at the shelter and Mr. Reynolds' involvement with that situation, we responded immediately." Mason and Reeves exchanged knowing glances. It was a diversion, Mason realized aloud. "Get law enforcement focused here while—" "The shelter," Elizabeth gasped, emerging from the cellar. "They're going after the shelter again, thinking Echo is still there. Or they're watching to see who responds," Reeves suggested, trying to confirm Echo's location. Deputy Clark looked thoroughly confused. Would someone please explain what's going on, and why you're both armed in the middle of the night? It's complicated, Mason began, then paused as Nancy appeared from the cellar, her expression urgent. Echo's gone, she said, her voice tight with concern. The storm shelter door was already open when we got down there. There are fresh tracks in the snow. The revelation hit Mason like a physical blow. Someone was already here, before the power went out. They took him while we were distracted. Or he fled during the commotion, Elizabeth suggested hopefully. Mason shook his head. He could barely walk. Someone took him. Reeves was already moving toward the door. We need to organize a search immediately. If Westfield's people have him— Wait, Nancy interrupted, her eyes sharp with sudden realization. The generator. Mason, when was the last time you checked it? Weekly maintenance, like I said. Sunday. And who performs that maintenance? Mason frowned. Pine Ridge Mechanical. They service most of the— He stopped abruptly. Westfield Foundation sponsors their apprenticeship program. The implications settled heavily over the room. Someone had gained access to Mason's property through legitimate means, studied the layout, and planned this extraction meticulously. We need to move now, Reeves said urgently. They can't have gone far in this weather with a dog in Echo's condition. As the deputies quickly organized a search pattern, Mason stood in the doorway of his cabin, scanning the snowy landscape now marked with multiple sets of footprints. Somewhere out there, Echo was being taken back to the people who had nearly killed him, people who now might finish the job. The familiar rage began to build in Mason's chest, but he channeled it differently this time. Not the destructive force that had damaged his post-military life, but the focused determination he'd relied on as a handler. "I'm coming for you, buddy," he whispered into the swirling snow. "Hold on." The search party spread out across Mason's property, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like searchlights. The blizzard had eased somewhat, but the fresh snow continued to fall, gradually obscuring the tracks they were desperately trying to follow. Mason moved with single-minded purpose, his eyes constantly scanning the ground, trees, and horizon for any sign of Echo or his captors. "Tracks lead northwest," Deputy Clark called out, crouching to examine a depression in the snow. "Looks like 2 sets of human prints and something being dragged." The mental image of Echo, weak and vulnerable, being dragged through the snow sent a surge of rage through Mason's body. He tamped it down, forcing himself to think tactically rather than emotionally. "They're heading toward the old logging road," he said, orienting himself in the darkness. "It connects to Route 16 about 3 miles from here." "They probably have a vehicle waiting." Reeves appeared beside him, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "If they reach that road before we catch up, we'll lose them." "Then we don't let them reach it," Mason replied grimly. They pushed forward, moving as quickly as the deep snow would allow. The deputies fanned out in a search pattern, but Mason took a more direct approach, cutting through the trees in what he calculated was the most efficient path to intercept. "Mason," Elizabeth called, struggling to keep pace with him. "Even if we catch up to them, what's the plan? They're clearly armed and prepared." "We get Echo back," he said simply, not slowing his stride. After 20 minutes of hard movement through the snow, Mason paused, raising his hand for silence. In the distance, he could hear the faint sound of an engine idling. They were too late. The kidnappers had reached their vehicle. "This way," he hissed, changing direction toward the sound. They emerged from the tree line to see a black SUV parked on the old logging road, its exhaust creating a cloud in the cold air. 2 figures were loading something into the back, a large duffel bag that Mason instantly recognized as containing Echo. Without hesitation, he surged forward, ignoring Reeves's whispered command to wait for backup. The element of surprise was brief but effective. He tackled the nearest figure before they could fully react, both of them crashing into the snow. Mason registered a familiar face beneath him, the young mechanic who had serviced his generator just days earlier. The recognition only fueled his anger as he pinned the man down. "Where are you taking him?" Mason demanded. The second figure moved quickly, and Mason heard the distinctive sound of a gun being cocked. "Let him go, Reynolds," a voice commanded. "This doesn't concern you." Mason turned to see a tall man with military bearing pointing a pistol at him. Behind them, Reeves emerged from the trees, her own weapon raised. "Federal agent, drop your weapon," she shouted. The standoff lasted only seconds before the sound of approaching deputies caused the gunman to make a split-second decision. He fired a shot wide of Mason, a warning, then dove into the SUV, dragging his accomplice with him. The vehicle roared to life, tires spinning in the snow before finding traction. As it pulled away, Mason made a desperate lunge for the rear door, managing to wrench it open. Inside, he glimpsed Echo in the duffel bag, eyes wide with fear. Mason's grip on the door handle faltered as the SUV accelerated, sending him tumbling back into the snow. He watched in helpless fury as the vehicle disappeared down the logging road, taking Echo with it. Deputies arrived moments later, immediately calling in the vehicle description and direction. But Mason knew the chance of intercepting them was slim. The storm would make pursuit difficult, and the SUV had too much of a head start. "I had him," Mason said, his voice hollow as Reeves helped him to his feet. "I was right there." "We'll find him," Reeves assured him, though her expression betrayed her doubt. "We have the vehicle description, and I got a good look at both men. We'll put out an APB immediately." Back at the cabin, the mood was somber as they regrouped. Elizabeth tended to a cut on Mason's face from his fall, while Nancy made coffee with shaking hands. The deputies coordinated with dispatch, setting up roadblocks on the main highways, though all knew the kidnappers likely had alternative routes planned. The younger one was Tim Garrett, Mason told Reeves. "Works for Pine Ridge Mechanical, serviced my generator on Sunday." Reeves nodded, making notes. "And the other?" "Never seen him before. Military bearing, though." The way he moved, how he held the weapon, definitely trained. "Another veteran recruited by Westfield," Reeves suggested grimly. "We've seen this pattern before, finding vulnerable former military personnel, offering them work, gradually pulling them into illegal operations." Mason paced restlessly, his mind racing. Where would they take him? Back to Westfield's hunting lodge? "Doubtful," Reeves replied. "Too obvious now that we know about it. They'll have a secondary location, somewhere secure enough to hold dogs for training and fighting. If they don't kill him outright," Nancy said quietly, voicing the fear they all shared. "They won't," Mason insisted, stopping his pacing. "Echo is valuable to them, both as an asset and as evidence they need to control. They'll keep him alive." "But in what condition?" Elizabeth asked, her voice breaking slightly. "After everything he's already endured." The question hung in the air, unanswered. Mason resumed his pacing, unable to shake the image of Echo's fearful eyes in the back of that SUV. The shepherd had survived so much, had begun to trust again, only to be thrown back into the nightmare he'd escaped. Dawn broke cold and clear, the storm finally passing. The search had yielded nothing. The SUV had vanished, likely on one of the countless logging roads that crisscrossed the mountains. Mason sat on his porch steps, exhaustion etched into every line of his face, as Reeves approached with a steaming mug. "You should get some rest," she advised, handing him the coffee. "You can't help Echo if you collapse." "I keep thinking about what they're doing to him right now," Mason admitted, his voice raw. "Whether he thinks I abandoned him, whether he understands what's happening." Reeves sat beside him, her own fatigue evident. "Dogs live in the present, Mason, but they also remember those who've shown them kindness. Whatever happens, he knows you tried to protect him." A police cruiser pulled up, and Officer Miller emerged, looking grim. "We found the SUV," he announced. "Abandoned at the Bridger trailhead about 40 miles east. No sign of the suspects or the dog." "They switched vehicles," Reeves concluded. "Standard evasion tactic." "There's more," Miller continued, hesitation in his voice. "We found blood in the back of the SUV. Not much, but—" Mason's hands tightened around the mug. "He was injured during the abduction." "Or he fought back," Nancy suggested, appearing in the doorway behind them. Don't underestimate that dog's will to survive, Mason. He made it to your doorstep half dead in a blizzard. He's a fighter. The words provided little comfort as the day progressed with no further leads. Reeves made dozens of calls, coordinating with VA resources and local law enforcement across 3 counties. Elizabeth returned to the shelter to maintain appearances, knowing that whoever had taken Echo might be watching for unusual behavior. Nancy reluctantly returned home, her age and arthritis making it impossible for her to continue without rest. Mason, however, refused to stop. He pored over maps of the region, marking potential locations where dogfighting operations could be concealed: abandoned farm properties, remote hunting cabins, decommissioned industrial sites. The list was dishearteningly long in this sparsely populated region. As evening approached, an unexpected visitor arrived. Dr. Morgan, the veterinarian, his ancient pickup truck rattling up Mason's driveway. "Heard about what happened," he said without preamble, as Mason met him at the door. "Elizabeth told me everything." Mason tensed, uncertain how much the vet could be trusted given the apparent reach of Westfield's influence. "Relax, son," Morgan said, reading his expression. "I've been treating abused fighting dogs for 30 years. I know what's happening in this county, and I've been trying to stop it with limited success. Your shepherd isn't the first victim I've seen, just the worst." "Do you know where they might have taken him?" Mason asked, hope flaring briefly. Morgan shook his head. "Not specifically, but I have treated dogs brought in by a man named Victor Hayes in the past. Always claimed they were hunting accidents, but I knew better. He stopped coming to me about a year ago, probably realized I was documenting the injuries." Mason exchanged a glance with Reeves, who had appeared in the hallway. "Victor Hayes," she repeated. "That name has come up in our investigation before, former military." "Marine Corps, I believe," Morgan confirmed. "Lives out by Elkhorn Ridge, keeps to himself mostly, but has connections with the Westfield Foundation. They funded some hunting therapy program he runs for veterans." "A potential lead," Reeves said, already reaching for her phone. "We can run background on him, see if there's any connection to the property records we're reviewing." As night fell once again, Mason found himself standing in the empty space by the fireplace where Echo's bed had been. The shepherd had occupied that spot for such a brief time, yet his absence felt enormous. Mason picked up the worn blanket that still held Echo's scent, his chest tight with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to fully acknowledge. He had failed Echo, just as he had failed Ajax in Afghanistan. The parallel was too painful to ignore. Another loyal dog, another situation where Mason had been unable to provide protection when it mattered most. The sound of Reeves ending a phone call broke through his dark thoughts. "We've got something," she announced, her voice tense with controlled excitement. Victor Hayes owns a property under an LLC that received funding from the Westfield Foundation last year. It's registered as a veteran rehabilitation retreat, but satellite imagery shows unusual security features for a therapeutic facility: perimeter fencing, regular patrol patterns, outbuildings with reinforced doors. "Where?" Mason demanded. "About 60 miles northeast, in the foothills near Blackwater Ridge. Remote, accessible only by a single private road, no neighbors for miles." Mason was already gathering his gear. "How soon can we move?" "Mason," Reeves said carefully, "this needs to be handled by proper authorities. I've called in a federal tactical team from Helena, but they won't arrive until morning. This facility could be housing multiple dangerous individuals, potentially armed, with attack dogs on the premises." "Echo doesn't have until morning," Mason countered, checking his rifle. "You saw his condition. Any additional stress or injury could kill him." "And rushing in without backup could get you killed," Reeves argued. "I understand your connection to Echo, but—" "You don't," Mason interrupted, his voice quiet but intense. "You don't understand what it means to be a handler. The bond isn't just emotional, it's a covenant. We ask these dogs to risk everything for us, to trust us completely. In return, we promise to never abandon them." "This isn't Afghanistan," Reeves said gently. "And Echo wasn't your military partner." "He is now," Mason replied simply. "The moment I found him in that snow, the moment he trusted me enough to lick my hand, despite everything humans had done to him, he became my responsibility." The determination in his voice must have convinced Reeves of the futility of further argument. She sighed heavily, then nodded. "If you're going, I'm going with you," she said. "But we do this smart, not just charging in. Reconnaissance first, then a tactical approach based on what we observe, and we call for backup the moment we confirm Echo's location." Mason agreed, knowing it was the best compromise he would get. As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth arrived with unexpected reinforcements, Officer Miller and Dr. Morgan. "Before you say anything," Elizabeth preempted Mason's protest, "we all know what's at stake here, not just for Echo, but for all the animals being abused in these operations. We're coming." Mason looked at the unlikely rescue party. A federal agent, a small-town police officer, a veterinarian well past retirement age, and a shelter worker with no tactical training. Under other circumstances, he might have laughed at their chances against a well-funded criminal enterprise. But as they loaded into vehicles and prepared to depart, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced since his military days, the unshakable resolve of a unit with a clear mission and shared purpose. Whatever awaited them at Hayes's compound, they would face it together. As they drove through the darkness toward Blackwater Ridge, Mason clutched Echo's blanket in his lap, the shepherd's scent a reminder of what they were fighting for. Somewhere ahead, a dog who had endured unimaginable cruelty was facing his tormentors once again. Whether Echo still had the strength to resist, to survive until help arrived, Mason couldn't know. But one thing was certain: Mason wouldn't fail him again, not while he still drew breath. Blackwater Ridge emerged from the darkness like a fortress, a sprawling property nestled against the foothills, surrounded by dense pine forest on three sides. The compound itself was illuminated by security lights that cast eerie shadows across the snow-covered grounds. From their vantage point on a neighboring ridge, Mason observed the layout through high-powered binoculars, mentally mapping entry points and security measures. 3 main buildings, he noted quietly. Central structure appears residential. The 2 outlying buildings have reinforced doors and small high windows, consistent with kennels or training facilities. Reeves nodded, making notes on a rough sketch. "I count 4 exterior guards patrolling in pairs. Regular intervals, military precision. These aren't local hired hands. They're trained professionals." "Surveillance cameras on all approach angles," Officer Miller added, his police training evident in his methodical assessment. "Motion sensors along the perimeter fence." "How do we get past all that?" Elizabeth whispered, her earlier confidence wavering in the face of the compound's formidable security. Mason continued scanning, seeking vulnerabilities. His gaze settled on a service road that curved behind the easternmost building. "Delivery entrance," he murmured, "less visibly monitored. Probably used for food supplies and waste removal. Still need to get through the perimeter fence," Reeves pointed out. "There," Dr. Morgan said suddenly, pointing to a dark spot along the fence line. "Drainage culvert, standard requirement for properties this size in watershed areas, would run under the fence." Mason adjusted his binoculars, confirming the doctor's observation. A large drainage pipe, probably 4 feet in diameter, emerged from beneath the snow near the northeastern corner of the property, extending under the fence toward the sloping terrain beyond. "Good eye, Doc," Mason acknowledged. "That could be our way in. Elizabeth and Officer Miller can remain here as our eyes, monitoring guard movements and providing cover if needed." "I'm coming with you," Elizabeth insisted, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. Mason started to object, but Reeves intervened. "Actually, we need her. If we locate Echo or any other dogs, they'll respond better to her presence. Dogs can sense fear and aggression. Having someone with animal handling experience will be crucial." "And I'm coming too," Dr. Morgan added firmly. "Those animals will likely need immediate medical attention." Mason recognized the determination in their faces and nodded reluctantly. "Officer Miller, you'll maintain position here. If anything goes wrong, or if we don't check in every 30 minutes, call for backup immediately." With the plan established, they moved carefully down from their vantage point toward the drainage culvert. The night was clear and cold, the recent snow providing both challenge and advantage. Their tracks would be visible, but the pristine white surface made detecting movement easier from a distance. At the culvert entrance, Mason paused to assess. Water trickled through the bottom, but the pipe was largely dry and wide enough for them to crawl through one at a time. The metal was bitterly cold to the touch. "I'll go first," he said, already positioning himself at the entrance. "Reeves at the rear. Stay low. Move slowly. Minimize noise." The journey through the culvert was claustrophobic and disorienting. The freezing metal leached warmth from Mason's body as he crawled forward, guided only by the faint light at the distant exit. Behind him, he could hear the labored breathing of Dr. Morgan, who, despite his age, was maintaining remarkable composure. After what felt like an eternity, Mason reached the exit and cautiously peered out. They had emerged behind a storage shed, partially concealed from the main security cameras by a row of evergreens. He signaled the others to wait, then slipped out, scanning for immediate threats before motioning them forward. "The eastern building is closest," he whispered once they had all emerged. "Based on the layout, it's most likely to house the dogs. We approach along the tree line, then use the shed as cover for the final approach." Moving in tight formation, they made their way toward the target building. Twice they froze as guard patrols passed nearby, pressing themselves into the shadows until the threat receded. The bitter cold made each minute of immobility a test of endurance. At the building's rear entrance, Reeves produced a set of specialized tools and made quick work of the lock, a skill Mason decided not to question. The door swung open to reveal a dimly lit corridor flanked by what were unmistakably kennels. The smell hit them immediately, the distinctive odor of too many dogs in too small a space, mixed with disinfectant and something metallic that Mason recognized with a sinking feeling as blood. From within the kennels came soft whimpers and the occasional muted growl. "My God," Dr. Morgan breathed, taking in the facility. "This is worse than I imagined." The kennels were essentially cages, each housing a single dog. Most were pit bull types, powerful and heavily muscled despite visible injuries. Many bore fresh wounds, torn ears, facial lacerations, puncture marks along their flanks. Some watched the intruders with aggressive intensity. Others cowered at the backs of their cages. "Fighting injuries," Dr. Morgan confirmed grimly. "Recent ones. They're actively using these dogs." Mason moved quickly down the line, scanning each kennel for echo. Most of the dogs were bully breeds, with a few Rottweilers and Dobermans mixed in, all breeds chosen for their strength and fighting potential. None were German Shepherds. "He's not here," Mason said, frustration evident in his voice. "There's another building," Elizabeth reminded him, though her attention was clearly torn by the suffering around them. "We need to check there too." "We can't leave these dogs," Dr. Morgan insisted. Reeves made a quick decision. "Elizabeth, stay with Dr. Morgan. Document everything. Use your phone. Get clear images of the conditions and injuries. Evidence collection is critical. Mason and I will check the other building for echo." Elizabeth nodded, already pulling out her phone. "Be careful. And find him." Mason and Reeves retraced their steps outside, the cold air a momentary relief from the oppressive atmosphere of the kennel building. They moved with greater urgency now, sensing that time was not on their side. The second outbuilding was similar in construction but smaller, with heavier security, an electronic keypad beside the reinforced door. Reeves examined it with a frown. "This will take time to bypass," she whispered. Mason surveyed the building, noting a narrow window set high in the wall around the corner. "There," he pointed. "Too small for a person, but we can see inside." They made their way to the window, and Mason boosted Reeves up to peer through the dirty glass. Her sharp intake of breath told him she'd seen something significant. "It's some kind of training room," she reported in a hushed voice. "Equipment, what looks like a fighting pit in the center, and cages along the back wall. Fewer dogs, maybe 5 or 6 total. One of them—" She paused, adjusting her position for a better view. "One of them is definitely a German shepherd, in the far corner." Mason's heart raced. "Is it Echo? Can you tell?" "Can't see clearly from this angle, but right size and coloring." "Yeah, the dog appears severely distressed, pacing in the cage." "We need to get in there," Mason said, lowering Reeves back to the ground. "Can you bypass that keypad?" "Yes, but it'll trigger an alert if I force it. We'd have minutes at most before the entire security team responds." Mason considered their options, weighing the risks. Before he could decide, his radio crackled with Elizabeth's urgent whisper. "Movement at the main house. Multiple people heading toward the kennel building. They know something's wrong." "Our entry must have triggered a silent alarm," Reeves concluded. "We're out of time for subtlety." With grim determination, Mason returned to the keypad door. "Get it open. Now." As Reeves worked on the electronic lock, Mason prepared himself mentally. If Echo was inside, getting him out safely was the priority. Everything else was secondary. The lock disengaged with a soft click, and they slipped inside, closing the door behind them. The training room was exactly as Reeves had described, a central pit surrounded by various equipment designed to build strength and aggression in fighting dogs. The stench of blood was stronger here, with dark stains visible on the pit's floor despite attempts to clean it. Mason moved immediately toward the cages at the back. 5 dogs were housed there, each in better physical condition than those in the other building. These weren't the expendable fighters, he realized. They were the valuable ones, the champions or trainers. And there, in the corner cage, was Echo. The transformation was shocking. Though still clearly underweight, the shepherd's coat had been cleaned, his wounds treated. He wore a heavy leather collar with metal studs, and his amber eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and something Mason hadn't seen in him before, rage. "Echo," Mason called softly, approaching the cage. The shepherd's head snapped toward him, teeth bared in a snarl that died as recognition dawned. The change was immediate and heartbreaking, the aggression melting into desperate hope as Echo whined and pressed against the cage door. "We found him," Mason breathed, relief washing through him as he worked to open the complicated lock on the cage. "Easy, buddy. We're getting you out of here." From outside came the sound of raised voices and running feet. Their discovery was imminent. "Mason," Reeves warned, positioning herself near the door with her weapon drawn. "We have maybe 2 minutes before they breach." The lock finally yielded, and Mason swung the cage door open. Echo stumbled forward, his legs weak, but his determination evident as he pressed his body against Mason's, trembling violently. "I've got you," Mason murmured, running his hands quickly over the dog to check for new injuries. "We're going home." The reunion was cut short by the sound of the door handle turning. Reeves moved to the side, prepared to confront whoever entered. The door swung open to reveal a tall, lean man with close-cropped gray hair and the unmistakable bearing of career military. Victor Hayes. Behind him stood 2 armed guards, their weapons already drawn. "Mr. Reynolds," Hayes said calmly, as if finding intruders in his facility was a minor inconvenience. "I believe you have something that belongs to us." "He doesn't belong to anyone," Mason replied, one hand resting protectively on Echo's head, "especially not people who torture animals." Hayes smiled thinly. "Such dramatic language. We're conducting specialized training for exceptional canine specimens. Echo 7 is perhaps our most valuable asset, which is why his unauthorized absence was particularly concerning." "Federal agent," Reeves announced, her weapon steady as she revealed her credentials. "You're facing multiple felony charges, Mr. Hayes. Animal cruelty, illegal gambling, operating a dogfighting ring, assaulting a federal officer during the abduction." "And who exactly witnessed this alleged abduction?" Hayes interrupted smoothly. A traumatized veteran with documented psychiatric issues, a small-town shelter worker desperate for funding, neither makes a compelling witness. His confidence was unnerving, the self-assurance of a man who believed he was untouchable. Mason realized with growing dread that Hayes likely had protection from powerful figures, perhaps even within law enforcement. "We have evidence," Mason countered. "Documentation of the injuries, Echo's condition." "A severely neglected animal you claim to have found by the roadside," Hayes dismissed. "For all anyone knows, you could be responsible for his condition." "In fact, that's precisely what our security footage will show. You abusing this animal, then attempting to blame us when discovered." The calculated nature of the lie sent a chill through Mason. Hayes had already prepared his defense, had likely been documenting a false narrative from the moment Echo escaped. "Enough talking," Reeves said sharply. "On the ground, all of you. This facility is being seized as a crime scene." Hayes sighed, as if disappointed by her lack of understanding. "I'm afraid that won't be happening, Captain Reeves. Yes, I know exactly who you are. The VA has been informed of your unauthorized investigation, your obsession with the Westfield Foundation, your history of making unsubstantiated accusations. In fact, by tomorrow morning, you'll likely be facing administrative review." For the first time, Reeves's confidence faltered slightly. "You can't possibly have that kind of influence. Charles Westfield sits on the Oversight Committee for Veteran Affairs," Hayes informed her with smug satisfaction. "He has exactly that kind of influence." The standoff stretched into tense silence, broken only by Echo's low growl as he pressed against Mason's leg. Despite his weakness, the shepherd's protective instinct was evident. He had positioned himself between Mason and the perceived threat. "Take the dog if you want him so badly," Hayes finally offered. "He's damaged goods now anyway, but understand this. The moment you leave this property, your lives as you know them are over. Mr. Westfield doesn't appreciate interference in his business affairs." The threat hung in the air, its implications clear. Even if they escaped with Echo, they would be discredited, possibly prosecuted on false charges, certainly targeted for retribution. Mason felt a familiar calm settling over him, the clarity that came in combat situations when options narrowed to their essence. He glanced at Reeves, a silent communication passing between them. She gave an imperceptible nod. "We'll be leaving now," Mason stated firmly. "All of us, including Echo." Hayes laughed shortly. "You misunderstand your position, Mr. Reynolds. You're not walking out of here. You're being escorted out after signing some paperwork acknowledging your trespassing and agreeing to certain confidentiality terms." "That's not happening," Reeves responded. Hayes's expression hardened. "Then perhaps we need to demonstrate the seriousness of your situation." He nodded to one of the guards, who raised his weapon and pointed it directly at Echo. "The dog can be replaced. Can your conscience bear watching him die, knowing it was your stubbornness that caused it?" Time seemed to slow as Mason processed the immediate threat. Before he could move, however, Echo acted. With shocking speed for his condition, the shepherd launched himself toward the armed guard, a blur of gray fur and bared teeth. The guard's shot went wide as Echo's jaws closed around his wrist. The shepherd's training was evident in the precision of the attack. Not a wild lunge, but a controlled takedown of an armed threat. Chaos erupted. Reeves engaged the second guard while Mason confronted Hayes directly. The former military man was skilled, blocking Mason's initial strike and countering with a vicious blow to the ribs that sent pain lancing through Mason's side. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Hayes growled as they grappled. "This goes beyond dogs, beyond Westfield. There are government contracts, military applications." Mason drove his knee upward, connecting solidly and ending Hayes's monologue. "I don't care who's backing you," he snarled. "This ends now." A gunshot cracked through the air, freezing everyone in place. In the doorway stood Elizabeth, pale but determined, Dr. Morgan behind her with Officer Miller's service weapon in his hands. "Enough," the elderly veterinarian said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Next shot won't be a warning. The momentary distraction was all Echo needed. The shepherd released the subdued guard and moved with purpose toward Hayes, a low, continuous growl emanating from deep in his chest. Hayes's eyes widened in what Mason recognized as genuine fear. "Call him off," Hayes demanded, backing away. "He's been triggered. He'll kill me." "Echo, halt," Mason commanded, uncertain if the dog would respond to basic commands after everything he'd endured. To everyone's surprise, Echo froze immediately, though his focus remained unwaveringly on Hayes. The response confirmed what Mason had suspected. Beneath the trauma and abuse, Echo's core training remained intact. He was still at heart a service dog. "Good boy," Mason praised softly, moving to stand beside the shepherd. "Stay with me." The next minutes unfolded in a blur of activity. Elizabeth and Dr. Morgan secured the guards with zip ties from their medical kit. Reeves placed Hayes under formal arrest, reciting his rights with grim satisfaction. Officer Miller's backup arrived, summoned when he lost radio contact with the infiltration team. Throughout it all, Echo remained pressed against Mason's leg, occasionally glancing up as if to confirm his handler was still there. Despite the chaos, despite the triggers that must have surrounded him, the shepherd maintained his composure, a testament to his extraordinary character. As dawn broke over Blackwater Ridge, illuminating the compound, now swarming with law enforcement, Mason sat on the tailgate of an ambulance with Echo beside him. "Doctor." Morgan had examined the shepherd, confirming that while he had new injuries from his brief time back in captivity, none were life-threatening. "He's incredibly resilient," the vet observed, gently wrapping a bandage around Echo's front paw. "But he'll need specialized care to overcome the psychological conditioning they attempted to reinforce." "He'll get it," Mason promised, his hand resting gently on Echo's head. Nearby, Reeves coordinated with the arriving federal agents, directing them to secure evidence and document the condition of all dogs on the property. Elizabeth moved from vehicle to vehicle, checking on the rescued animals now being prepared for transport. Hayes sat in the back of a police cruiser, his earlier confidence replaced by grim resignation as he watched his operation being dismantled. The consequences he had threatened were still a concern, but for now the immediate victory was theirs. "What happens next?" Mason asked when Reeves finally approached him. "We've only scratched the surface," she admitted. "Hayes was middle management at best. Westfield is the real target, and he's protected by wealth, influence, and an army of lawyers. This will be a long fight." Mason nodded, understanding the reality of their situation. They had won a battle, not the war. Westfield would likely retaliate, using his considerable resources to discredit them, possibly worse. As if reading his thoughts, Reeves added, "You should know that by involving yourself in this, you've made some powerful enemies. Your life may never be the same." Mason looked down at Echo, who had finally succumbed to exhaustion and fallen asleep against him, the shepherd's breath coming in peaceful, regular intervals for perhaps the first time since Mason had found him. "Some things are worth the risk," he replied simply. 1 year later, the first snow of winter dusted Pine Ridge in a gentle white blanket. Mason stood on his rebuilt front porch, watching Echo patrol the perimeter of the property, a routine the shepherd had established himself and maintained with military precision. Despite the cold, Mason smiled as he observed the dog's confident movements, his once skeletal frame now filled out with healthy muscle, his coat thick and lustrous. "Still checking for intruders?" Nancy called as she made her way across the connecting path between their properties, a basket covered with a checkered cloth in her hands. The past year had been kind to her. Her arthritis appeared less troublesome, and a new brightness animated her movements. "Every morning and evening," Mason confirmed. Some habits from his training never quite faded. Echo noticed Nancy's approach and abandoned his patrol, trotting over to greet her with a dignified restraint that melted into undignified enthusiasm when he caught the scent from her basket. His tail wagged vigorously as he pressed his nose against the cloth. "Don't pretend I didn't see that," Nancy chided the shepherd with affection. "Yes, these biscuits are partly for you, but you'll have to wait until after breakfast, like a gentleman." Inside the cabin, now expanded with a new wing that served as both office and therapy space, Elizabeth was setting the table for their weekly breakfast gathering. The shelter director had undergone her own transformation, more confident, less deferential to authority, and utterly committed to the animal welfare foundation she now ran with Mason's help. "Dr. Morgan called," she informed them as they entered. "He'll be a few minutes late. Apparently, Mrs. Thornton's retriever decided that 6 a.m. was the perfect time to go into labor with 11 puppies. "That man should have retired years ago," Nancy commented, setting her basket on the counter. "Though I suspect he's more energetic now than before all this started." Mason couldn't disagree. The elderly veterinarian had become a central figure in their unconventional family unit, his medical expertise crucial to the rehabilitation of the fighting dogs rescued from Blackwater Ridge. Against all odds, they had managed to save and rehome over 20 of those dogs, with the remaining few living permanently at their newly established sanctuary on the outskirts of Pine Ridge. Echo settled in his spot near the fireplace. Not the nervous huddle of a year ago, but the relaxed posture of a dog who knew he was home. His amber eyes tracked Mason's movements with the unwavering attention that still sometimes caught Mason off guard with its intensity. "Any word from Reeves?" Nancy asked, helping herself to coffee. Mason shook his head. "Not since last month. She's deep into the federal case against Westfield. After Hayes agreed to testify in exchange for reduced charges, things accelerated." The mention of Hayes brought a momentary tension to the room. Victor Hayes had ultimately become their most valuable asset in dismantling Westfield's operation, a development none of them had anticipated. Following his arrest, the former military man had suffered what appeared to be a crisis of conscience, offering detailed testimony about Westfield's entire network in exchange for consideration during sentencing. "Hard to believe Hayes turned on them so completely," Elizabeth remarked, echoing Mason's thoughts. "Not that hard," Nancy countered. "Men like Hayes operate on a clear hierarchy of loyalty. Once Westfield abandoned him, which he did, immediately disavowing any knowledge of Hayes's activities, that loyalty dissolved. Mason suspected there was more to it than that, though he kept the thought to himself. During a private conversation shortly after his arrest, Hayes had revealed something unexpected. He had served briefly with Mason's former unit in Afghanistan, had known Ajax, the K-9 partner Mason lost. That connection, however tenuous, seemed to have affected Hayes in ways Mason still didn't fully understand. The sound of tires on gravel announced Dr. Morgan's arrival, and Echo rose immediately, moving to the door with anticipatory excitement. The relationship between the shepherd and the veterinarian had evolved into something special. Echo seemed to recognize Morgan as the healer he was, offering a unique gentleness during their interactions. 11 healthy puppies, all accounted for, Morgan announced as he entered, pausing to greet Echo with a thorough ear scratch. "Mrs. Thornton is naming one after each disciple, minus Judas, of course, which leaves her with one extra she's calling Blessing." The normality of the conversation, puppies, breakfast, community gossip, still occasionally struck Mason as surreal after the intensity of the previous year. The transition from crisis to routine had not been easy for any of them, particularly as the legal and personal ramifications of their confrontation with Westfield unfolded. As promised, the wealthy philanthropist had used his considerable influence to retaliate. Mason's military pension was temporarily suspended pending a review that dragged on for months. Elizabeth faced an audit of the shelter's finances that nearly shut them down. Dr. Morgan's veterinary license was briefly questioned based on anonymous complaints. Most concerning had been the break-in at Nancy's home 3 months after the Blackwater Ridge raid. Nothing stolen, but papers clearly searched, and a single dog tag left prominently on her kitchen table. The message was unmistakable. They were being watched, their vulnerabilities known, yet they had survived. adapting and finding strength in their unlikely alliance. The establishment of the Pine Ridge Animal Recovery Sanctuary, funded initially by a surprisingly substantial anonymous donation that Mason suspected came from a guilt-ridden haze, had given them a shared purpose beyond mere survival. "How's the newcomer settling in?" Morgan asked as they settled around the table, referring to their latest rescue, a blind border collie saved from a neglect situation. "Better every day," Elizabeth reported. "Echo's been remarkable with her, seems to understand she can't see and deliberately makes noise when approaching so she doesn't get startled." Mason glanced at the shepherd, who had returned to his fireplace post but remained attentive to the conversation. "He's a natural therapy dog, has been since the beginning." The memory of those early days, Echo responding to Mason's PTSD episodes, providing comfort despite his own trauma, remained vivid. The shepherd's innate empathy had ultimately become the foundation of their sanctuary's mission, pairing rescued animals with veterans struggling with PTSD and other service-related challenges. Their breakfast was interrupted by Mason's phone buzzing with an incoming call, Reeves's name flashing on the screen. He excused himself to answer, a familiar tension returning to his shoulders. Calls from Reeves rarely brought casual news. "Mason," her voice came through, characteristically direct. "It's happening." Westfield was indicted this morning on 37 counts, including animal cruelty, illegal gambling, fraud, money laundering, and witness intimidation. They took him into custody at his Manhattan office. A wave of emotions washed over Mason. Relief, vindication, but also caution. Will it stick? He has powerful connections. "Some of those connections are now distancing themselves," Reeves replied, satisfaction evident in her voice. "The evidence Hayes provided led to financial records that implicated several political figures. Nobody wants to be associated with him now." "And the animals, the evidence of the fighting ring?" "Central to the case," she assured him. "Your documentation and testimony will be essential during trial." Which brings me to my second reason for calling. The Bureau of Animal Welfare wants to feature Echo in their National Rehabilitation Program. His recovery represents everything they're trying to achieve. Mason watched the shepherd, now dozing peacefully by the fire. "No cameras, no publicity stunts," he said firmly. "Echo's not a mascot. He's earned his peace." "Understood," Reeves agreed easily. "But would you consider allowing a small team to observe your sanctuary's methods? The success rate you've achieved with both the animals and veterans is unprecedented. There's potential to replicate your model nationally." The prospect was simultaneously flattering and daunting. Their sanctuary had grown organically, shaped by the specific needs of the animals and people involved. Mason wasn't sure their approach could be systematized or replicated. "I'll discuss it with the others," he promised, ending the call after Reeves shared a few more details about the indictment. When he returned to the table, 3 expectant faces greeted him. He shared Reeves's news, watching their expressions shift from tension to cautious celebration. "So it's really over?" Elizabeth asked. "The legal battle is just beginning," Mason cautioned. "But Westfield's ability to retaliate against us specifically has been significantly diminished. His assets are frozen, his foundation under investigation. I'll believe it's over when he's convicted," Nancy said pragmatically. "Men like that have escaped justice before." "True," Dr. Morgan agreed, "but they didn't have Echo's story to contend with." He glanced at the sleeping shepherd. "People can justify many things, but cruelty to an animal who still shows such capacity for forgiveness and service, that touches something fundamental in the human conscience." Mason considered this as they resumed their meal. Echo's journey from the brink of death to vibrant recovery had indeed become something of a legend in their community and beyond. The before and after photos Elizabeth had documented were powerful testament to both human cruelty and redemption. After breakfast, as Nancy and Dr. Morgan helped clean up, Mason stepped outside onto the porch, needing a moment of solitude to process the news. Echo followed, pressing against his leg in what had become their routine gesture of connection. "We did it, buddy," Mason murmured, resting his hand on the shepherd's head. "Westfield can't hurt anyone else now." Echo looked up at him with those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to understand far more than should be possible. Then, unexpectedly, the shepherd moved away, trotting down the porch steps and into the yard where he began digging purposefully at a spot near the old oak tree. "Echo, leave it," Mason called, puzzled by the sudden behavior. The shepherd ignored the command, a rarity, and continued digging with focused determination. Mason approached, curiosity overcoming his initial concern. What he found buried there defied immediate explanation. A small metal box, weathered but intact, containing a single set of military identification tags along with a faded photograph. The tags bore the name of a soldier Mason had never met, but the photo showed a younger Victor Hayes standing beside a German shepherd with the distinctive white diamond marking on its chest. Not Echo. This dog was older, larger, but unmistakably similar. On the back of the photo, a simple inscription: Ranger and Hayes, Operation Mountain Guardian, 2009. Echo sat beside the unearthed box, watching Mason with an unreadable expression. "How did you know this was here?" Mason whispered, though he expected no answer. "And how did Hayes know to bury it on my property?" The questions hung in the crisp morning air, unanswerable, yet somehow not troubling. Mason had long since accepted that some aspects of his connection with Echo defied conventional explanation. The shepherd possessed an awareness and intelligence that sometimes seemed to transcend ordinary animal cognition, perhaps a result of his specialized training, perhaps something innate to his character. Mason carefully replaced the items in the box, but didn't rebury it. Hayes had clearly intended for it to be found eventually, had perhaps even told Echo of its location during those brief days of captivity. Another piece of the complex puzzle that was Victor Hayes, a man capable of both cruelty and conscience, perhaps seeking some form of redemption through this strange offering. "Mason?" Elizabeth called from the porch. "Everything okay?" He turned, box in hand. "Yeah, just another mystery from our past that Echo's helping solve." As they walked back to the cabin, Echo moving confidently at his side, Mason reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a half-dead shepherd in a snowstorm. The road had been harder than any of them could have anticipated, marked by danger, betrayal, and painful revelations. Yet it had also brought healing, purpose, and an unconventional family bound by something stronger than blood. Inside, Nancy was regaling Dr. Morgan with stories from her Vietnam veterinary days, while Elizabeth reviewed applications from veterans seeking to participate in their therapy program. The scene embodied everything their sanctuary had come to represent: second chances, unexpected connections, renewal. Echo settled once more by the fireplace, his posture relaxed but alert, a guardian at rest but ever vigilant. His journey from skin and bones, abandoned on a roadside, to this moment of contentment embodied both the worst and best of humanity. The capacity for calculated cruelty, but also for compassionate intervention. "You know, Doctor," Morgan said, noticing Mason's contemplative expression, "in all my years of veterinary practice, I've never seen anything quite like Echo's recovery. Physically, yes, animals can heal remarkably given proper care, but psychologically, most dogs subjected to that level of abuse never fully trust again. Yet here he is, not just functioning but thriving, helping others heal." "He made a choice," Nancy observed quietly. "Somewhere along the way, despite everything humans did to him, he chose to believe in the possibility of goodness again. That's the miracle here." Mason couldn't have expressed it better himself. Echo's journey from victim to healer represented something profound about resilience, about the capacity to transcend trauma without erasing it. The shepherd still carried scars, still had moments of fear or reactivity, but had somehow integrated these experiences into a deeper wisdom. As the day progressed into evening, Mason sat on the porch once more, Echo beside him, watching the season's first substantial snowfall begin to blanket their sanctuary. 1 year ago exactly, he had found a dying shepherd in a similar snowfall. A moment that had altered the trajectory of numerous lives, exposed a criminal enterprise, and ultimately created a place of healing for both animals and humans, broken by circumstances beyond their control. "Ready to go in, buddy?" Mason asked as the temperature dropped. Echo rose, shook off the accumulated snowflakes, and pressed warmly against Mason's leg, their private gesture of connection. Together they turned toward the light spilling from the cabin windows, toward the voices of their unconventional family, toward the future they had built from the ashes of trauma and pain. The shepherd, who had once been nothing but skin and bones, abandoned on a roadside, now moved with the quiet dignity of a survivor who had transcended his wounds to become something more, a healer, a guardian, a bridge between broken souls and the possibility of wholeness. And in that transformation lay the answer to the question embedded in Mason's Sanctuary's mission statement, painted simply above its entrance. What can the wounded teach us about healing? Everything, as it turned out. Absolutely everything. From skin and bones to salvation, Echo's journey reminds us that it's never too late for a second chance. When Mason found that skeletal shepherd in the Montana snow, neither could have known how they would heal each other's deepest wounds. Through bitter cold and cruel betrayals, Echo's unwavering spirit showed us what resilience truly means. His transformation wasn't just physical, it was a soul reclaiming its purpose. The unlikely family that formed around him, Mason with his battle scars, Nancy with her lifetime of wisdom, Elizabeth with her compassionate heart, and Dr. Morgan with his healing hands, proves that family isn't always blood. It's who stands beside you when the blizzards of life rage strongest. Echo's story teaches us that our darkest chapters don't define us, they prepare us. The abandoned can become essential, the broken can become healers, and sometimes the ones society discards become its greatest teachers. Have you ever experienced an unexpected connection that changed everything? Or witnessed an animal's remarkable ability to overcome trauma? Share your stories below. Every journey of healing deserves to be honored, and your experiences might just be the lantern someone else needs to find their way home.